right, my name's Dave Lesh. I want to welcome you to the 2017 Iowa City Book Festival, presented by the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature. We'd like to thank the sponsors who made this event possible: City of Iowa City, University of Iowa, Iowa Arts Council, Iowa City Coralville Convention and Visitors Bureau, Iowa Public Radio, and the Tuesday Agency. The vast majority of book festival events are offered without charge, but they aren't free. Your tax-deductible donation gives us the ability to offer programs like this festival. Please consider supporting the City of Literature by texting the word book to 319-774-7669 and follow the link. That's the word book to 319-774-7669. Today, as part of this panel discussion on politics, we will hear from Jennifer Pritchard, Okky Madasari, Ramsha Ashraf, Loren W. Cooper, and Nathan Englander. They will discuss how their current political landscape in their countries affects their work. The panel will be moderated by our own Chris Merrill, director of the International Writers Program. Suchi Pritchard, if you could maybe wave to the crowd. She is a bhakti yogi, visual artist, Sanskrit kirtan songstress, and poet. She currently hails from British Columbia, Canada, but she has spent significant time in the prairie lands of Saskatchewan and Iowa. Okky Madasari. She's a novelist from Indonesia. She's the founder and director of the ASEAN Literary Festival. In 2012, her novel, The Outcast, received the Katulistiwa Literary Award. Ramsha Ashraf. She's a poet and a playwright from Pakistan. She has a collection of poetry, Enmeshed, and she publishes poems on her blog Escritura 415 and elsewhere, and contributes to literary magazines. Loren Cooper is the author of 4 novels, 1 short story collection, 1 nonfiction work. His first novel was nominated for the Endeavor Award. His 4th novel, Crosstown, will hit bookstores on November 14th. He currently lives in Cedar Rapids. Nathan Englander, the author of the novels Dinner at the Center of the Earth and The Ministry of Special Cases, and the story collections For the Relief of Unbearable Urges and What We Talk About When We Talk About Anne Frank, which won the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He is Distinguished Writer in Residence at New York University. Chris Merrill's going to take over. Please help me welcome our panelists.
Thank you, Dave. The always thorny relationship between politics and literature is the theme of our panel today, and we'll ask each of the writers to make some comments, and then we'll open it up to questions. And when we get to that point, if you could make your way to the microphone in the back so that we can record every part of the event. And we'll start in Indonesia with Okky.
Okay, thank you. I'm Okky Madasari. So we have panel in politics, and the main question of this panel is how current political situation influence writer. Maybe I can start with a word, populism. That's the word that describes the current political situation around the world now. Here in the US, in my home country, in Indonesia, in Europe, and in many countries in the world. Populism, when mass used by the elite, or when elite just want to serve what the mass want in order to preserve their power. That's exactly what happened in my country after we entering the democracy system in 1998 until now. And for the biggest Muslim population country like Indonesia, of course, the mass is the majority religion. Politicians deliberately use religion issues, religion sentiments, religion identity to get support from people, to win the election, to preserve power. That's why so many injustice happens to minority group, to those who maybe consider cannot give benefit in the election, in the system that everything count by number. As a writer, I really aware of this situation, and I also really aware that in a society where injustice considered as a normality, we cannot write a story for the sake of writing. My novels, all of my writing, are always political and personal at the same time. Political, because I always raise the problems in my society, the injustice issues through my novels. When politicians and government don't care about that, or maybe just pretend that the problem doesn't exist. I wrote a story about minority group who has been persecuted because of their belief and until now living in a shelter just because of their belief for more than 10 years. I wrote a story about being transgender in a country like Indonesia and how fundamental group deals with such kind of issue. I also wrote story about lives under the dictatorship before 1998, and I also have story about how corruption become massive in today's Indonesia. Politics always been my inspiration, but I really believe that fiction is fiction. I write a story. I'm a storyteller. No matter how I put political statement, political aspect in my novel, I should present it as a story, not argument, not article in a newspaper. No matter I believe that my novel should be a resistance of injustice, it's not a political pamphlet, nor demonstration banner. That's why I said my novel is always political and personal at the same time, because at the end of the day, it's not only my political statement, but it's also my personal imagination. It's also my artistic expression, my hope, my fear, my experience, and also my fantasy. Thank you.
So I tend to write science fiction and fantasy as well as nonfiction. And in some ways, political discourse has always been something of an exercise in fantasy and science fiction if you think about utopian and dystopian works. And so, Aristotle said that man is a political animal. And if you look at some of the works at that time, whether it's Plato's Republic or you look at Lucian with his fantasies and his fishing for philosophers off of the walls of Rome with gold coins, that satire is another element basically in terms of commenting on the political environment. And the ability to construct or deconstruct a particular society and a particular argument around a political environment is a very powerful tool. It's one of the things, that's, again, kind of endemic throughout literature. It's a continuing Ganankan experiment. There's a ton of examples out there, whether it's modern science fiction and fantasy, everything from Gordon R. Dixon and Colin Lord to Heinlein's works to Le Guin's protest works, or if you go back to Wells and the Time Machine talking about class extremes, or even for that matter the satires of Swift. All of these things basically give you a powerful platform to do the work. But I think one of the important points around this is that as a writer, at the end of the day, it's our obligation to inform as well as instruct, but not necessarily to do damage to either one. And so in a political environment where it's inescapable, there's an opportunity to drive a message, but you don't want to do that at the expense of didactism. And that, I think, was one of the points that Okky was making was if your didactic impulse overrides the story, you've just undercut both the story and the message that you have to drive. But the passions of dissatisfaction with the political environment are also powerful driving forces. If you look at some of the things that we've seen in recent American politics, I'm not sure that there's a fiction writer, even in fantasy or science fiction, that could have predicted the election and the course of the election that we just had. However, at a metaphorical level or at a more abstract level, it's easy, I think, to basically draw parallels with forces like oligarchy and those kinds of things as they get exercised, and then put those into a work and translate those from, the underlying kind of contemporary situation to more the universal. And I think that's what literature does. Good literature, like Lucian, like H.G. Wells, survives its time and drives a message that may come back around. It's not necessarily dependent on the time and the setting and those kinds of things. And that's allowing the story to drive over kind of the didactism. So I guess to wrap all of that together, politics and the climate is almost unavoidable. From a fictional perspective, taking the specific to the universal is where the power is really at in terms of driving the message.
So I'm from a very pastoral, relatively peaceful place, British Columbia, Canada. And so, it's one of the last places one would become politically intrigued out of the pastoral, because we're just surrounded by it. We're very fortunate. However, there was like this knocking on the other side of the wall or just across the border, and the knocking just kept getting louder. And I had been living monastically in Eastern study centers, that sort of thing. But as the knocking got louder and louder, it followed onto the page. As a bit of a hobbyist Marxist, R.I.P. Karl Marx. He died in 1883. There's been this misinterpretation of cultural Marxism, and it's been used by the right to as this sophist argument against family and values, and it's not really at all what Karl Marx espoused himself. And so that would be my little contribution into political theory. And then I just thought I'd read a couple of poems. These two were written on Election Day and then published on Inauguration Day in this little magazine called Killjoy. So, feed the circus animals. How many words are there for things that haven't been? Wings bigger than a body, and still you cannot fly. How many stories are there for those that haven't been? How many stories are there for those that wish they could jump? Still, you cannot. Simply, you cannot take flight at dome's edge, held by no one. At dome's edge, watch for naught but leaves rustle. Turn my cheek, I feel the manufactured breeze. Its smooth caress, big brother, holds me, feeds me bread. Only she'd said, let them eat cake. And this was written around the time, well, pretty much Election Day, but then part 2 was written last week. I can't divide the quilts. Stitches come undone, fabric into edges at the edge of our divide. The quilt patches fading on a nation unseam sentiments. Why paint the barn? Instead, fence the sky. Say, no trespass. Painted on trains, blur by on the trestle. Horn this, alarm sounds trespass into our ears, into our sleep. Wolves gather into our field keep, but we don't wake up from this, our trespass dream. 2, this is not a river, but you can walk on either side. This is not a street, but people pass me by. This is not my flag, of which much is woven, warp and weft frayed, the story tired, sentences bind constituents, whispers deciduous fall. This is not a tree, though I wish its limbs would cover me. This is not a prison, we're free. This is not a barren landscape, doors stand wide open without walls. This is not brackish water on fields sown mercury lace, I have not. not forced labor, but forced listlessness, stilted songs, anthem trapped in a larynx bound, no longer hungry. I am starving, but I forget. I am for neither right nor left, knee up, down, turn around, his knee at my face, the wall, hands up, waving stripes, bled stars, under sky. There is no tree, but I wish its limbs would cover me. But I forget, because the parking lots lit up halogen spill, because all the TVs are on in the store windows, and we cannot sleep, so we forget to dream under the overpass that covers me. And I was in a few different regions in Europe, and there was, a lot of people like in Paris under the overpasses and just living, and it was something to try to be a tourist in Paris, and you cannot ignore what's going on over there. And finally, and I did check if it was okay to swear, and they said it was all right, so. Okay. Oh, America. America, you were my security blanket while I was being fucked by the overlord. When I got older, I saw the overlord was your best comrade. America, you speed by between truck stops selling NRA porn t-shirts. Bang me, I like your rifle. America, you are a red shiny gumball toy machine selling pedophile grooming. America, you make liquid gold Budweiser shotgun homecoming queens riding high denim cutoffs, and daddy gives his daughter a chastity prayer promise ring. America, I wish I had a rage to tell the truth. I wish I was a poet in red cowboy boots, but I am another made-up monarchical Disney-style meltdown, a Midwest Hollywood starlet wannabe grand publicist's dream. America, I wish I was Allen Ginsberg, brave queen bee of the beat poetry scene, and not a goddamn golden pussy holed up behind this blinking cursor in a basement. Oh, but America, I am not your Rapunzel with ropes of hair. So do forgive me for being a Canadian, and I wore my red Converse. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for being here. My name is Ramsha Ashraf and I'm from Pakistan, as I was introduced. Mirza Asadullah Khan Ghalib is considered as the literary giant of South Asian literature. I don't know how many of you are familiar, but I'm going to read a verse from Ghalib because it sums up my being here. And he says, Ghalib-e khasta ke bagair kaun se karobar band hain? Roiye zar zar kya, kijiye hai hai kyun? And I give you the loose translation. It refers to, like the poet is trying to say that he is non-significant, and the world would go on in its flow, even if the poet doesn't exist. So it's just a homage to my, insignificant entity. When it comes to politics in Pakistan, I guess the way Okky mentioned that there is one word, populism, I guess there is one word, and that is confusion, anxiety, ambiguity, and unclarity. And we recently celebrated our 70th birthday in August, but even after 70 years, we still think about these terms, be it confusion, be it anxiety. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the past, but after partition in 1947, we were just trying to recover from that turmoil, and that's a very radical term to use, turmoil, for partition in Pakistan. We were still trying to recover from that process. However, we went through another radical phase, political phase in 70s, including dictatorship, Islamization, and then it led towards Talibanization in 2007. So things remained quite radical, and I grew up in an environment where I had been, given a kind of exposure in which theological tradition was more important because state celebrates, the national narrative celebrates a particular theological approach. So I guess it was a kind of resistance or recovery period in which I grew up reading Faiz Ahmad Faiz when he says, "Mere dil mere musafir hua phir se hukm sadir, watan badar ho hum tum, dein gali gali sadaएं, करें रुख नगर नगर का कि यार कोई पाएं किसी यारे नामबर का, हर एक अजनबी से पूछें जो पता था अपने घर का." And this line is significant. हर अजनबी से पूछें जो पता था अपने घर का. That is, we are going to ask every other foreigner about our own homeland. So this was the thing I grew up. This was the thing I grew up realizing, and this was the thing I grew up, processing in my head. So when I started writing about things, of course, I couldn't talk about direct political issues. For example, forced religious traditions. I couldn't talk about feministic ideas. I couldn't talk about my going out in public sphere. I couldn't talk about emancipation of women because it comes along with political tradition. And it reminds me that the panel I presented last week, Emancipating Bodies and Encountering Taboos, I used this term that there is institutionalized hegemony of power structure. So when we say that there is institutionalized hegemony, it certainly refers to the political narrative. And state narrative is no separate from political narrative. So the resistance and recovery comes when I try to somehow loathe myself in my poetry, and when I try to use undertones, mocking different institutions. And when I say different institutions, it's not only one institution, it's military, it's maybe dictatorship, it's maybe religious forces, it's maybe fundamental forces. So when I go out and talk about political narratives in Pakistan, it's not as simple as people imagine setting out, because there are so many complicated web of things going on. The best thing I could devise was the literary protest in a very non-political way. And that is, I'm going to read this poem to you, which was considered a very, controversial subject, and you're going to analyze why. It's titled as Death Sirens. It was written in 2010, and it was published by 2 magazines in Pakistan. And it created quite a hype and quite a trouble for me, even working at my professional space. It became quite difficult for me. Death Sirens. You're inside me in what you call simple adjustable possession, your limbs touching mine, locked in each other's arms. We are trying to explore the caves behind our lips. Suddenly we hear a call for funeral ceremony from a nearby mosque. Our passions melt down. We try hard to make it up again, but we can't find a way. Hopelessly desperate from sickening desire, you do what you feel right. You soak me in the white fluid that I don't know if I adore, more than the hair on your chest. You ask me, what's the matter? I say nothing, ignoring the fact that I'm stuck with the death sirens. And it was taken to the task because of the hidden political connotation. We have a very rigid, fundamental religious culture, and the ones who are familiar with South Asian standards of living, they can relate to the poem. So when it comes to politics, I guess I'm not as direct as people like, let's say, Nina Simone, because I referred to her, or maybe people like Toni Morrison, or maybe people like Ichabi. But I still can relate to what they were doing, but I'm not as direct because I'm not given that space to be direct. So it's kind of a literary protest embedded and entwined with what they call love poetry. That's it. Thank you.
Awesome. I made a little shriek as a Nina Simone fan. I squeaked in her ear while she was talking. I'm Nathan. It's great to be back in Iowa City. I'm an workshopper, so I got to live here for a couple of years, which is a joy. I show up at these things, which is so nice to meet people and hear them talk, and then I wonder about the seating arrangement. But I think we started with a country that's new to democracy, adopting it, and then we end with an American, since we are currently dismantling it. So we have the whole shape of democracy, and I wish I was only partially kidding. And also, yeah, we have two Yankees on the panel also, so I was trying to think, oh, yes, why two... there's a Canadian, so I won't say Americans. We're all living on the continent, but United States citizens here. But yeah, I guess it's because of what I write about, and I will be strict to the prompt, which was talking about, your country's politics. So I often write distant. That is, for me to get close and naked and raw, and the things that I obsess about politically, I usually go far away. That is, if I'm talking about writerly freedom, I set that story in, Stalinist Russia in 1952, and my first novel is set during the dirty war in Argentina, where I look at injustice, and cities that turn on their citizens and governments gone awry, which obsesses me. And my book that I'm probably here for, which is Dinner at the Center of the Earth, which is an exploration. I lived in Jerusalem for many years, and I moved there for a peace process that I watched fall apart, that I watched get taken away from us, that I still would like to fight for. Yes, and that book is really, exploring that eternal conflict that I think doesn't have to be eternal. But it's really talking about your own country's politics, which is really specific for me, because, Argentina is not my home, and, Israel and Palestine are not my home. But I can talk not as much about how those countries feed into my politics, or how they, how America feeds into my books, but maybe how those crazy cycles when you live inside your head. Because I love the didactic point was made at the beginning. Nobody wants a lecture. It has to be from the soul, from the heart. Why, as an Orwell fan or whatever, it has to be your true self. But I've had twice in both books, I've had the driving point of the book that I was writing about another place visit us here. That is, I started my Argentina, my Dirty War book in the 90s, and my exploration of democracy gone awry, of a country falling apart, like literally the end of democracy, I grabbed onto the notion of habeas corpus, which they suspended in the Dirty War in 1976, because I thought at the time when habeas corpus, when the concept was put out there, when they got habeas corpus, it was, you could run someone over with your carriage and keep going. You could draw and quarter someone for sport in the town square. A good portion of this planet was not even, considered human. You could still own people, and even they recognize that everyone has the right to challenge his or her own detention. And it was in the middle of writing that book that we, opened Guantanamo Bay in my country, and we still don't have habeas corpus here. We still have people locked up and untried. And that is, that was life-changing for me as a writer. I had never lost that feeling of what it is for your fictional world to crack open and reverse. That is, when the book came out, it looked like I was making a political statement about habeas corpus. I was just grabbing onto what is, to me, as a concept. This is an inalienable human right that suddenly in my home country is, we literally still have people uncharged as we go about our business. And, more currently and right now with Dinner at the Center for that novel, I was really exploring my time in Jerusalem and the peace process and what went wrong. And one, we understand, that it is gone and inevitable, but I'm telling you, as someone who is as if I've been thawed out, frozen in time, like it was right there. You know what I'm saying? Peace was happening. It was ours. And this notion 20 years later with a wall up for 2 decades where you want to say, oh, it's impossible, it can't be. I'm telling you, it could be. And I watched it, and I spent these 20 years thinking about, what was missing, what went wrong, aside from the fact, back to American Parallels, that it takes so much human capital, so much positive energy to build good things, to do great things, and so few people to tear it all apart. I'm telling you, I watched the peace process burn down by a few people, and I'm watching our democracy here be deconstructed by a few powerful. I rarely make the generalization anymore. I would say men. There's a couple of women, but mostly, like that idea. So the lesson, the one thing I want to share from there that we have now imported here from Israel and Palestine is people would address that peace process as if it was two people on the sides of a subject with a disagreement. You know what I'm saying? You hold one position, I hold another. Like, how do we feel about freedom of speech? Here's your line, here's my line. That's an idea. But what was clear to me living in Jerusalem was that I was a Jewish boy living in Jerusalem, and my holy site was the Temple Mount, and my Palestinian neighbor, she was living in El-Quds, and her holy site was Haram el-Sharif. Like, we were literally, it was not trying to get people to understand on a spectrum or this terrible disagreement. We were living in separate realities, sharing the same space, breathing the same air, but one reality and another reality, different memories, different history, different truths, different absolutes. And that's the world that has to get bridged to make peace. And what, again, I just never expected that notion to come to my own states, to America. I didn't want to, I hope, they ask if you brought fruit. I didn't mean to bring that back here. You know what I'm saying? But I don't have a whiteboard. I could put up 2 pictures in this room and it will split of 2 inaugurations, vastly different pictures, of crowds, one inauguration, another inauguration, and this room would split, not because anyone's lying, that comes from above, not because anyone's being political or dissembling. I'm saying good Americans, we would all feel we're picking the picture with the most people in it, but some people would be pointing to the picture and saying the picture with less people has more people, not as a lie, but as a reality. We suddenly have what I watched tear Israel apart in the United States, which is different realities, different truths. We live in different worlds in the same place, and again, I'm here talking about it because I'm not ready to give up democracy here, and I'm not ready to have 2 truths. There are facts, there are truths. God bless you. She sees the truth. But yeah, so that notion that obsessed me for 20 years from there, again, I find it in my day-to-day here, and I say I find it both extraordinarily dangerous and really not too late to fight for, there is right and wrong. You know what I'm saying? You want to give kids health care, that's something you can discuss. Taking it away, children will die, you can do it. But, you are culpable. We have responsibilities and we have truth.
Thank you all. We have a provocative set of statements, and I'm going to guess that there will be some questions from the audience. And if you want to ask questions, as I said, to go back to the microphone in the back. And while you're thinking about that, then maybe I will say, picking up on something that Nathan was talking about and that we also heard from Loren and from Ramsha, we have different ways to approach political matters, either positing it in a distant country or in a dystopia or writing in a different kind of space. When we're living in these uncertain times, and as we start thinking about moving forward, what do we do? I mean, I'm interested to know what Nathan's next going to write. I want to hear where Ramsha's poems are going to take her. Loren, are we going to get a dystopia, a utopia?
So actually, as is not uncommon with science fiction writers, I have a few different universes, and sometimes they collide, sometimes they don't. One of them is a future history, and inherent in the view in that particular future history, the history of the concilium is effectively oligarchic forces. And it's the stability of the oligarchy is actually generated by the fact that it has this long continuing resistance to the oligarchy. Now, I have started that early in my career, and it's formed over 20 years, and I have a novel that has not yet been sold that's coming out of that universe. But it's interesting because I find that those things that I was thinking about based on where we were then, which seemed interesting times, are becoming far more interesting, far more threatening, and far more real in a way that I didn't predict associated with kind of that look at it. Because I do think that certain things, like a formalized resistance, actually tend to reinforce and buffer the very thing that it intends to bring down. And that is an interesting dynamic, because in attempting to break that dynamic, in attempting to do more than resist and change things, the danger that you run historically is not simply managing to eliminate the thing that you're attempting to get rid of, but instead to put something up in its place that potentially is worse. And so it's a powerfully difficult dynamic, and I think it goes back through human history. How do you How do you rearrange the landscape without blowing everything up and tearing it down to rubble?
Do you want to go first? Oh, no. All right, Chris. That's interesting. Because having my privileged yet marginalized status in my mind, I guess I feel that there was this person sitting with me, our fellow participant from Kazakhstan, Yuri, and he said that poetry is a moment, and it happens to you, and moment fades away, which I believe strongly. But at the same time, I have this strong feeling that I'm going to grow towards ghazal, and I'm going to have some kind of, experimentation, political experimentation with ghazal, because ghazal remains some kind of ambiguous tradition, and I like to find spaces in cocoons. So if you're, because you know about Agha Shahid Ali, so the way he speaks about Kashmir and he speaks about, politics of his homeland, I am more interested in going towards that dimension. I don't know if I would be able to do that in the certain context, but I'm more interested in going back towards ghazal. And that's the recent project I'm working on. But at the same time, it's very, I mentioned Yuri's statement, a moment, poetry is a moment, because it's very interesting. You keep making plans and you keep thinking about different literary traditions, but you never know that even forced displacement, it ignites that fire to write, 6 poems after someone. So I cannot say anything, with a very concrete vision that what I'm going to do with my work. But it certainly is there, the idea.
I might just to clarify, Ramsha's talking about the Kashmiri American poet Agha Shahid Ali, who challenged American poets to write, as he said, real ghazals in English. It's an ancient Persian and then Arabic and finally Urdu form. And the poet you were talking about earlier, Fez Ahmed Fez, was someone who used that form to move from the beloved in his ghazals became as often the idea of revolution.
So right? Yes, but in Fez's poetry, we do not have ghazal. Ghazal tradition in Agha Shahid Ali comes from Mirza Sadullah Khan Ghalib, and Fez is a poet of reverse. And the amazing thing about Fez is that the idea of beloved is not of a woman, it's of some kind of a revolutionary idea. It's of, some kind of traditional romance with revolution. And it remained a very powerful tool of resistance in 70s in Pakistan. So yes, and of course you can talk about Agha Shahid Ali, because I was intrigued to know that Agha and you were like very good friends, and you know about Agha more than I can, I can talk about.
But he was writing about Kashmir, which remains in a kind of geopolitical netherworld 70 years after the fact.
Which is wonderful, because the kind of geopolitical narrative he utilizes within this form that is ghazal, it's amazing the way you're going to use a traditional form and then you're going to bring in ideas that are very radical in their existence, but it appears very, it appears very beautiful, like a Fez's poem or like a Ghalib's ghazal on paper, but it has a very strong political connotation attached to it. Yeah.
What comes next? Politically, yeah, I was gonna say it's fiction writing. It takes forever. It's not your Twitter feed. You know what I'm saying? I love my Twitter feed because it's all the injustice that I put in my writing. But every second you'd be like, wait, they have emails. She had email. You know what I'm saying? All day long. We have to keep monuments to slavery. Like, wait, but we can drill our national monuments for oil. You know, like that's what Twitter is. It's like a nice hypocrisy injustice feed. But yeah, writing takes time, and I think it's really. I get all touchy-feely about writing. It is about the writer's heart. Like, you can't choose a political subject. I think you just tell your stories, as I used, both examples of the world changing. By the time I finish my work, the world has changed, and you have to see if it has relevance. Literally, I just was talking about this. I felt ethically and morally, and this is so kooky and vulnerable, but when I was writing this Israel-Palestine novel, I felt I personally had to pray that it would hit the stands as like historical fiction and be an old story, and that I would have nothing to talk about on NPR. I was like, I have to root against my own book and not even want to be current. That's that's where my heart should be. But yeah, back to stories. I think the main thing when writing about politics, is that notion. I think if you've come to books, if you're a writer, it's from childhood, from when I was a person with questions. The books that I love didn't offer answers. I'm saying they raised questions, they wrestled with questions, and I think that, I worked so hard in this novel. That was the whole point of this, its insane structure, was I wanted people to be able to enter into the Israel-Palestine conflict. Like, we all come to these ideas fully, I want to say locked and loaded, but we have a gun plague, so that doesn't even work anymore. But we all come with preconceived positions. We're all, not ready to shift. And I wanted a book where people could reflect on it. And it reminds me of, a huge early influence, but John Gardner's On Moral Fiction. That's why I think fiction writing is a moral act. But he was the one who said, that a story, it should be a place, a novel should be a place to test your values. You know what I'm saying? It can't be an experiment. He uses chemistry experiment as an example, but it can't be sterile, because sterile is, that is for laboratory experiments, but a book that is 50-50 is so balanced as to be not alive. The world is always imbalanced. It always shakes things up. Things never match equally. But I do think, if you're talking about the political element of a book, that really just takes us to moral and ethical ideas, and that inside the novel is where we should go to be able to see a mirror of ourselves. That's how it should work. That's how reading has always been for me. Even hearing people talk, and that's why it's a subversive form. All of us sitting together, that's why, again, a writer mostly can't get a taxi in this world, but when there's a totalitarian regime, they know to come after writers. You know what I'm saying? Because it changes minds. If you look at people, different experience. The Bosnian writer, Alexander Hamon, we call him Sasha, you can call him Sasha, but Alexander Hamon, you know what I'm saying? He watched his country fall apart. You should hear him talk about what's happening here. He has been through this, he has watched this, and I feel like that's why writers are dangerous, because he's been sounding the alarm in his work and writing for a long time, and that's how I use fiction, to explore and to reflect.
Is there a question?
Yeah, there's many questions that come up, but I'm trying to distill things down a little bit. I just started reading an old novel by Ariel Dorfman. I don't know if any of you are of the generation to remember him, but he was a Chilean. He was involved with Allende in Chile, and eventually had to get out of the country because he was likely to be killed if he stayed in the country by Pinochet. But he wrote a novel, and he wrote it surreptitiously, in the sense that he changed the name of the author. It was not his name. Mm-hmm. And he put it in a country other than Chile, and he put it in a time many years in the past. And he did that, he said, when it was finally published, the regime in Chile had changed, and it was no longer so controversial for Mr. Dorfman to have done something. So he put a preface in it and said that the reason that he wrote it under a pseudonym and changed the country and the time and whatnot was because he wanted it to be read by his fellow countrymen in Chile. And if he didn't hide what he wanted to say by all this stuff, it would never be allowed in Chile, or anybody that they found with it would be in big trouble. from what I gather, all of you can publish and will not be in big trouble, regardless of what you publish, regardless of what you say. And I just wondered whether, at one time, a long time ago, the American system, the US system, pardon me, was described as a marshmallow. I mean, a marshmallow, if you're inside, it's really soft, you can move around, but you never really get anywhere. I mean, you're always in the flux of it. Have any recent events in your country affected the way you write, in the sense of who do you want to write for?
So maybe we can. Okay, do you want to take that question on?
Yes, there is big event in Indonesia that affect everything. It was first 1965. It's about communism. You know, everything related to communists being persecuted. There is massacre and something like that, mass killing. And yeah, I think it's happened not only in Indonesia but in many countries. But and then another most important event is 1998, when we leave the dictatorship era and then entering the democracy. And I'm in this moment. I mean, I didn't talk anymore about the communism, but I focus in the 1998 and after 1998. So before 1998, Indonesia under the dictatorship, military was very dominant. Military rule everything, and it was very impossible for writers to publish any kind of literary works that very critical to the government and to the military. My first novel, The Years of the Voiceless, is about the military dominant, it's about the dictatorship, and my publisher said it will not publish if I wrote it before 1998. But I published it in 2010, so there is no problem with my first work at all. It can publish, it can read by all of people. But the problem is when I publish my third novel, when I publish my fourth novel. After 1998, military is not the dominant power anymore, but the fundamentalists, the Islam, the power that related with the Islam as a majority religion, increasing and strengthen time by time. So everything that considered like insulting or criticism to Islam will be dangerous than literary works that may be critical to the government and military work. So when I published my fourth novel, it's about transgender and about how the fundamentalist group do some persecution or destroying cafe, and then come to the show of transgender and then drink beer, alcohol. My publisher withdrew my novel, even it has been published 2 weeks and distributed in the bookstore already for 2 weeks. They are afraid. My publisher really afraid. So the book withdraw, and they asked me to do some editing. So it was very crazy situation, and it was very hard situation for me as a writer, because I'm talking about freedom. I'm talking about how we should have courage to tell everything, to fight against injustice, and then I have to face my own publisher to do some editing just because of the question of fear, just because of my publisher is afraid. But the fairness is not just come out of nowhere. It's so many precedents. The group can come, the fundamentally can come to the publisher, can destroy bookstore, and even can make the editor and writer get jail. Because we have blasphemy law. And it just happened early this year when the governor, can you imagine the governor of Jakarta? Jakarta is capital city of Indonesia. The governor is Chinese. And now he is in jail because he accused for doing blasphemy. That's crazy situation in Indonesia. So I understand. So now I can understand why my publisher so afraid. So yeah, and then choose to withdraw my book. And by the way, I have to admit that. And then after very hard negotiation, I agreed to edit some part. That's very sad, but I don't have option. But for another version, I mean the English version, and the book has been published in German already, it's in original. But for the version in Indonesia, I have doing some editing, especially, so I don't describe that the group drinking alcohol, for the example, or I don't describe where is the base, home base of the group, so the group cannot think that it's about them. So that's crazy. And for my first novel, it has nothing. I mean, there is no problem when I am very critical to the military, to the government. But my editor was worried about the one part when I describe how cleric having a sexual intercourse with a girl. My editor asked me to edit it as just flirting. but the editing, they asked me before it published. So I said, okay, I will change it, not intercourse, but maybe just flirting. And then my book published. But for my fourth novel, that was crazy experience because it's already published. Thank you.
I have a comment
So
to
did they
make.
go from drinking beer to coffee?
Coca-Cola.
I have a comment to make, actually. I feel when she talks about blasphemy law and, things of the kind, I feel that she's talking about Pakistan, and it's so similar and parallel to what is happening there. But I have an answer to my target audience, and I always have, the targeted audience was the 95% of population we have in Pakistan, not the 5% elite. I never wrote for elite. And one demonstration of what I'm saying is that I always choose local publishers. Even after having offers from international publishers, I don't go for that. And also writing in indigenous, because I write dramas in Urdu and I write poetry in Punjabi. It serves the purpose of, conveying message to the audience I have. Again, I'm saying that it's very, I shouldn't use the word national, but I guess it's very much focused on people in Pakistan. It's not some kind of national thing, but it's focused on people living in Pakistan. And I don't have international audience as my target. And rest, Okky described my condition, so I don't need to repeat it.
Suchi, did you want to say something?
Well, just going from both of these about the writing itself is that, we're faced with conflicts in writing and what we see in the world, and there's unresolvable conflicts, or that might be how we perceive things as unresolvable conflict out here. Yet what we do on the page, and by not staying complacent, is, something for the future, in that right now we're studying still many pieces of work from the Second World War, and you know, the changes that you were having to make for your books. It's like looking at, okay, there's this unresolvable conflict for publishing in her own country, yet the book is still getting out there to Germany. And so I think just we have an opportunity, and I'm working on a really long dystopian piece, and I reached an impasse with it. So I gave a very short amount of time to creating a utopian ending. So yeah, there's staying in that. I'm, you know, from a very peaceful pastoral place, so staying in that within the conflicts I do see that are unresolvable, yet on the page, what can happen?
Oh, it's just different. You know, the thing that's vastly different in the United States, I mean, we can all address every country and everything. That's the point of being able to speak and have free speech. But yeah, now just the way our culture is now, I don't know any I mean, I know writers of specific subjects, you know, writing about pit bulls or whatever. You might get some grief and stuff like that, but while our First Amendment is intact, it's the journalists who are suffering now and receiving, you know, real threats, you know, on the internet, you know, violent imagery that, you know, the president, you know, tweeting, you know, like a CNN journalist, you know, face getting hit by a train, or challenging already, you know, whether we should have free speech, whether the station should have license. So yeah, for us in the States, you know, it's not about fiction writers right now. You know, we're not getting that kind of attention to the work and those kind of threats, but it's our, you know, the journalists are really, it's shocking what I'm hearing about what they're personally receiving in terms of, you know, threats, and what we're hearing from the White House about, you know, just constant attacks on the media that are just obviously disturbing, because our, you know, we seem to be run by constitutional originalists, except for the First Amendment, which is now under assault from the White House.
I just read in the news just now, to kill a mockingbird just removed from the 8th grade curriculum because it's considered uncomfortable.
Oh, but
in the U.S.
yes,
school, it's
yes.
crazy.
Well,
it's
and
crazy.
that's an old. That's one thing that I was going to note, is that's actually one old impulse that we've grappled with, and that's not new with To Kill a Mockingbird. Catcher in the Rye, same thing. There's a number of books that are continually under assault because people believe that they are not appropriate for the age group, or not appropriate to be in an official curriculum that's out there. And it's basically, you know,
we have a banned
representatives of particular groups, effectively. So that voice, we have the First Amendment, but we also have channels for people to potentially challenge who can see certain things, particularly depending on how it's funded. It's not that To Kill a Mockingbird won't be out there, but certain people can work within their communities to make sure it's not in their schools. And so that's and that impulse, well, the dangerous thing potentially about that, I mean, it's kind of this balancing act, right? So we don't necessarily see that in fiction, but depending on how the impulse overrides, those become channels for working beyond journalism and into fiction and into, you know, state-controlled, state-approved, you know, kinds of things. So it's not unthinkable here by any means, and that controversy is nowhere new. Nothing like that.
And I think it gets to balance of power. Like, as a Brooklynite writer, where like I can't walk down the street without seeing all of contemporary literature. Like, yes, right, exactly. There really is. We celebrate Banned Book Week. You know, like people, let's read the banned books now. But yeah, it's not. It doesn't feel like a threat to my work. But you're right that the threat is there. It's just not in power, and it is increasing.
Right.
Yeah, that was well said.
We don't really have much time left, but I thought it might be useful just to ask each writer to tell us a writer we should be reading in light of the question that we're talking about now, or a book that you found particularly interesting in these changing circumstances.
Reverse order? 1984 is just a guide. You know, if aliens landed, I'd give them that. But I would also say contemporary, like both, Alexander Hemon, you know, I would, let's say Lazarus Project, maybe.
Yeah.
So I would suggest Saadat Hasan Manto and Intezar Hussain, both are writing. One, Saadat Hasan Manto writes about pre-partition, partition, and post-partition scenario. And Intezar Hussain peculiarly writes about post-partition scenario. So both are available in translation. So I guess that would be a good read according to the political setup we have.
I guess Canadian pick would be The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood. Yeah, and Susan Sontag, her book regarding the pain of others.
I do a callback actually a little bit to a Vietnam War veteran named Joe Haldeman. He wrote a book called The Forever War that is very interesting, very well done. It's very funny, very erudite, and it's a little bit of a rewrite of Heinlein's Starship Troopers. A lot of social commentary in there, but one of the things that makes it particularly relevant is the fact that we continue to be in this state of war that is now almost ignored because of everything else that's going on. We've been in the longest continuous state of war that we've ever been in our history as a country. And the Forever War talks about how the soldiers on the battlefield basically become more and more disattached from the society at home as the war goes on. And I think that it was extremely relevant then. I think it's very relevant now. And it's just something to continually be thinking about.
I forgot something because I can't remember the author's name, but it's Just and Unjust War Theory by, I'll look it up.
Michael Walzer.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, there is Indonesian giant. The name is Pramudia Anantatur. He wrote about colonialism. He wrote about nationalism. He wrote about humanism, and of course, he gives big inspiration to the new writers in Indonesia. The book published by Penguin, but yeah, sadly, Indonesian writer, Indonesian literature has not in the mainstream book industry and mainstream literary scene in the world. But yeah, maybe you can help us to read it and to spread it. Pramudia Anantatur, yes.
Well, and it goes without saying that you need to read all of these writers who have given us such a wonderful panel. Big hand of applause. Thank you.